The dust never settled in Cedar Ridge, Nebraska in the summer of 1887. It clung to everything: the weathered wooden planks of the farmhouse, the faded calico dresses hanging on the line, and most persistently to 17-year-old Mary Catherine Sullivan's worn leather boots as she walked the perimeter of her father's struggling wheat farm. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, already promising another scorching day that would crack the earth further and drain what little hope remained in the community. Mary Catherine wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her pale skin. Her auburn hair, once vibrant and carefully braided by her late mother, now hung in loose, practical strands beneath a sun-bleached bonnet. "Mary Cat," her father's voice carried across the field, hoarse from years of calling out orders and breathing prairie dust. "Come help me with the well pump." She turned toward the sound, watching Thomas Sullivan's tall, lean frame bent over the stubborn machinery that had been giving them trouble for weeks. At 52, her father carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, or at least the weight of keeping their small farm afloat in increasingly difficult times. The death of her mother 3 years prior had left them both struggling to fill roles they'd never expected to carry alone. "Coming, Pa!" Mary Catherine called back, but her voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. The monotony of farm life had begun to suffocate her spirit, each day blending into the next like watercolors in the rain. As she walked toward her father, her eyes caught sight of something she'd somehow never noticed before: a thin ribbon of water cutting through their eastern pasture, glinting silver in the morning light. The stream seemed to beckon to her, offering a path away from the endless cycle of chores and worry that defined her existence. "Pa," she said, reaching his side and noting the deep lines of frustration etched around his eyes, "when did that stream start running through our land?" Thomas looked up from the pump, following her gaze. "Oh, that old thing. Been there since before we settled here, I reckon. Your ma used to say it came down from the hills, but I never paid it much mind. Got more pressing matters to tend to." He returned his attention to the pump, muscles straining as he worked the handle. "Now hold this steady while I try to prime it." Mary Catherine dutifully held the pump handle, but her thoughts remained with the mysterious stream. In all her years on the farm, she'd never explored beyond the immediate boundaries of their property. The stream represented something she couldn't quite name: possibility, perhaps, or simply escape from the crushing loneliness that had become her constant companion. The pump suddenly lurched to life, spurting brown water before clearing to a steady, clean flow. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "There we go," he said, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Sometimes things just need a little coaxing. A little patience." He studied his daughter's face, noting the distant look in her green eyes. "You seem different lately, Mary Cat. More restless." She shrugged, not wanting to burden him with her own struggles when he carried so many of his own. "Just thinking about things, Pa. About Ma, about what she'd want for us." Thomas nodded slowly. Since Ellen's death, he and Mary Catherine had developed an unspoken understanding about grief. They carried it quietly, separately, trying not to let it drown them both. But he could see in his daughter's eyes the same yearning that had once driven him to leave his family's farm in Ohio and seek a new life in Nebraska territory. "Your mother was always one for exploring," he said softly. "Used to drive her own car near to distraction, wandering off to see what was beyond the next hill." He paused, studying Mary Catherine's face. Maybe it wouldn't hurt for you to do a little exploring of your own. Farm work will always be here when you get back." The permission, or perhaps blessing in his words, surprised her. "Really, Pa? Just be careful, and don't stay gone too long. And Mary Cat," he placed a calloused hand on her shoulder, "your ma always said that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to follow your feet until they can't take you any further." That afternoon, after completing her morning chores and preparing a simple lunch for her father, Mary Catherine found herself standing at the edge of the stream, Up close, she could see it was deeper than it appeared from a distance, with clear water flowing steadily over smooth stones. Small fish darted between the rocks, and dragonflies skimmed the surface. She removed her boots and stockings, lifting her skirt slightly to wade into the cool water. The sensation was immediate relief from the oppressive heat, but more than that, it was freedom. For the first time in months, she felt truly present in her own life, not simply going through the motions of survival. The stream curved away from the farm buildings, winding toward a line of low hills in the distance. Mary Catherine had never ventured that far from home alone, but something about the water's steady flow gave her confidence. It seemed to know where it was going, even if she didn't. As she walked alongside the stream, following its meandering path through tall prairie grass and scattered wildflowers, she began to notice signs of life she'd missed from the confines of the farmyard. Rabbit tracks in the mud, a red-winged blackbird's nest cleverly hidden among the cattails, the sweet scent of wild roses blooming despite the drought. The further she walked, the more alive she felt. The constant ache of loneliness that had settled in her chest since her mother's death began to ease, replaced by curiosity and wonder. This was what she'd been missing, not just the physical exploration, but the sense of being part of something larger than her daily struggles. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Mary Catherine realized she'd been walking for several hours. The hills were closer now, and she could hear something that made her heart quicken, the sound of falling water. A waterfall, hidden away from the world, calling to her like a secret waiting to be discovered. She quickened her pace, following the stream as it curved around a stand of cottonwood trees. And there, tucked into a natural amphitheater of red rock and green vegetation, was the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. The waterfall wasn't large, perhaps 15 feet high, but it was perfect. Water cascaded over smooth stone into a clear pool surrounded by ferns and wildflowers that seemed to thrive in the mist. The sound was music after years of prairie silence, and the air felt cooler, almost magical in its freshness. Mary Catherine stood transfixed, understanding for the first time why her mother had spoken of the importance of following streams to their source. This wasn't just a destination, it was a revelation, a place where beauty persisted despite the harsh realities of frontier life. As she approached the pool, planning to sit on a large boulder and rest before the long walk home, her eye caught something that shouldn't have been there, something that made her blood run cold despite the warm afternoon air. Partially buried in the soft earth near the pool's edge, almost hidden by overgrown grass and wildflowers, was what looked like a piece of weathered wood. But as she knelt for a closer look, she realized it wasn't wood at all. It was part of a human skeleton. Mary Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to look more carefully. The bones were old, bleached by years of weather, but they were undeniably real. And there, glinting in the late afternoon sun, was something else that made her stomach drop. A metal badge, tarnished and partially buried, but still bearing the unmistakable star of a lawman. She scrambled backward, her mind racing. Who was this person? How long had they been here? And why was a sheriff's badge buried with bones at a hidden waterfall that no one was supposed to know about? As if the discovery wasn't shocking enough, Mary Catherine heard something that made her freeze in terror. The sound of approaching horses, their hooves thundering across the prairie at full gallop, heading directly toward the waterfall. Someone was coming, and something told her that being found here now with this discovery would put her in terrible danger. Mary Catherine's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Heart hammering against her ribs, she forced herself to move, scrambling toward the thick stand of cottonwood trees that flanked the waterfall. The ancient trunks and dense undergrowth offered the only concealment in the small canyon. She pressed herself against the largest tree, its rough bark catching at her dress as she tried to make herself invisible. Through the gaps in the leaves, she watched 3 men on horseback emerge from the prairie and rein in their mounts near the pool. The leader was a man she'd seen before, Jake Morrison, who owned the largest ranch in the county and served as the unofficial authority in Cedar Ridge since there was no official law enforcement. He was in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of cold eyes that made people look away when he stared. The 2 men with him were his ranch hands, brothers named Carl and Dutch Kowalski, known throughout the territory for their willingness to solve problems with violence. "This is it," Morrison said, dismounting with practiced ease. His voice carried clearly across the small space. "The old sheriff said he'd hidden it near the waterfall right before you put a bullet in his back." Carl Kowalski finished with a laugh that made Mary Catherine's skin crawl. Morrison shot him a warning look. "Keep your voice down, you fool. Even out here sound carries." He walked to the edge of the pool, his movements purposeful. "It's been 8 years since Sheriff Harrison started asking questions about our cattle operations. 8 years since we had to silence him. The money should still be here." Dutch, the younger of the Kowalski brothers, tied their horses to a low branch. "What if someone else found it?" "No one comes out here," Morrison replied with confidence. "This place is cursed according to the local tribes. They avoid it, and so does everyone else." He began walking around the pool's perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground. Harrison was smart, I'll give him that. He figured out we were altering brands and selling stolen cattle to the railroad camps. But he wasn't smart enough to keep his mouth shut. Mary Catherine's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. Sheriff Harrison, she remembered the name from conversations between her parents years ago. He'd disappeared mysteriously, and everyone assumed he'd moved on to another territory, but he hadn't left at all. He'd been murdered, right here at this beautiful, hidden place. "Found something," Carl called out from near where Mary Catherine had made her discovery. He was kneeling by the partially exposed bones, but his attention was focused on something else, a leather pouch, water-stained but intact, that had been buried nearby. Morrison strode over and snatched the pouch from Carl's hands. He opened it carefully, and even from her hiding place Mary Catherine could see his face light up with satisfaction. $2,500 in gold coins, Morrison said, his voice filled with greed. Plus, the documents Harrison thought he could use against us. He pulled out what appeared to be a bundle of papers wrapped in oiled cloth. Bills of sale with altered dates, correspondence about our arrangement with the railroad buyers, everything that could have hanged us. "What do we do now?" Dutch asked, eyeing the exposed bones nervously. "Someone might find this place." Morrison considered this, his calculating gaze sweeping the area. "We take what we came for and cover this up properly. But first..." He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and began flipping through pages. Harrison was thorough in his investigation. According to his notes, he told someone about his suspicions before he confronted us. Mary Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. Someone else had known about the sheriff's investigation. "Who?" Carl demanded. "A farmer's wife named Ellen Sullivan. Harrison's notes say she was helping him document our cattle movements because their farm borders our grazing routes." Morrison's expression darkened. "She was supposed to meet him here the day after we killed him, to give him more information." The world seemed to tilt sideways for Mary Catherine, her mother. Her mother had been involved in investigating Jake Morrison's criminal activities. Her mother had been the sheriff's secret informant. "Ellen Sullivan's been dead 3 years, Dutch pointed out. "Died of fever, didn't she?" Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. "Fever, right." He tucked the notebook away. "The woman got too curious for her own good, started asking questions around town about Harrison's disappearance, had to be dealt with." The words hit Mary Catherine like a physical blow. Her mother hadn't died of fever. She'd been murdered by the same men who had killed Sheriff Harrison because she'd been trying to expose their crimes. Rage and grief crashed over her in equal measure, but she forced herself to remain still and silent. Getting caught now wouldn't bring her mother back. it would only result in her own death. "We need to make sure this stays buried," Morrison continued, apparently oblivious to the life-changing revelation he'd just delivered. "And we need to keep an eye on the Sullivan farm. The daughter's grown now, and if Ellen passed any information to her—" "Want us to pay them a visit?" Carl asked, cracking his knuckles. "Not yet, but watch them. If Mary Catherine Sullivan starts asking questions or poking around where she shouldn't—" Morrison let the threat hang in the air. Mary Catherine felt terror and determination war within her chest. They knew her name, they were watching her family, and they had killed both a lawman and her mother to protect their secrets. The three men spent the next hour carefully reburying the sheriff's remains and covering any trace of their presence. They took the gold and documents, leaving no evidence of the murders except for Mary Catherine's own memories. As they prepared to leave, Morrison took one last look around the peaceful waterfall. "Remember, no one talks about this, ever. The cattle operation has made us all wealthy, and it'll continue to do so as long as we keep our mouths shut and eliminate any threats." What about the Sullivan girl?" Dutch pressed. Morrison mounted his horse, his expression thoughtful. "For now, we watch and wait. But if she becomes a problem—" He drew a finger across his throat in a gesture that needed no interpretation. The three men rode away as suddenly as they'd arrived, their horses' hooves thundering across the prairie until the sound faded to nothing. Mary Catherine remained hidden for another hour, making sure they were truly gone before emerging from her hiding place on trembling legs. She stood at the edge of the pool where her mother's murderer had just stood, where a good man's bones lay hidden beneath the earth, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. The lonely, restless farm girl who had followed a stream seeking peace was gone. In her place stood someone harder, angrier, but also more determined than she'd ever been. Her mother had died trying to expose the truth. Sheriff Harrison had died because he'd gotten too close to that same truth. Now Mary Catherine carried the burden of that knowledge, and with it a terrible choice. She could pretend she'd never seen or heard anything, return to her quiet life on the farm, and let her mother's killers continue their profitable criminal enterprise. Or she could find a way to seek justice, knowing that doing so would almost certainly cost her own life. As she began the long walk home through the gathering dusk, Mary Catherine Sullivan made her decision. She would not let her mother's death be in vain. She would find a way to expose Jake Morrison and his accomplices, no matter the cost. But first, she needed allies. She needed proof. And most of all, she needed a plan that wouldn't get her killed before she could see justice done. The stream continued its steady flow beside her as she walked, carrying secrets and sorrows toward an uncertain future. And with each step, Mary Catherine felt herself becoming someone she'd never expected to be. Someone capable of fighting back against the darkness that had stolen so much from her family. The waterfall's song followed her across the prairie, a reminder of beauty and peace that existed even in the midst of terrible truths. It would be her anchor in the storm to come. Mary Catherine barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, while her father's steady breathing came from the room across the hall, and wrestled with the terrible knowledge burning in her chest like a fever. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake Morrison's cold smile, heard his casual admission of murder, felt the earth-shaking revelation that her mother had been killed for seeking justice. By dawn, she had made several decisions. First, she couldn't tell her father, not yet. The knowledge would destroy him, and worse, it would put him in immediate danger. Thomas Sullivan was a good man, but he wasn't a fighter, and his grief would make him reckless. Second, she needed proof beyond her own testimony. Morrison was powerful, respected in the community, and no one would believe the word of a lonely farm girl against his without evidence. Third, she needed to learn more about her mother's involvement in the investigation. As she prepared breakfast, eggs from their struggling hens and biscuits made with carefully rationed flour, Mary Catherine studied her father's weathered face. Had he known about Ellen's secret activities? Had he suspected that her death wasn't natural? "You're quiet this morning," Thomas observed, accepting the plate she handed him. "How was your walk yesterday? Find anything interesting along that stream?" The innocent question nearly made her choke on her coffee. "Just a waterfall," she managed. "It's beautiful. Ma would have loved it." Something flickered in her father's eyes at the mention of Ellen. "Your mother was always drawn to water," said it reminded her of possibilities, of places yet unseen. He set down his fork, his expression growing distant. "There's something I should tell you, Mary Cat. Something I probably should have shared long ago." Mary Catherine's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "What is it, Pa?" Thomas rose from the table and walked to the small chest where Ellen had kept her few precious possessions. He opened it and withdrew a leather-bound journal that Mary Catherine had never seen before. "Your mother kept a diary," he said, returning to the table. "Started it right after we moved here, documenting our new life. But in the months before she died—" He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he held the journal. "She wrote about things that worried me. Strange things happening around the county, cattle disappearing, questions about people in positions of power." Mary Catherine's mouth went dry. May I read it?" Thomas studied her face for a long moment. "She mentioned you in the later entries. Said she hoped you'd grow up to be someone who wouldn't stay silent when she saw injustice." He placed the journal in her hands. "Maybe it's time you knew the kind of woman your mother really was." Alone in the house, while her father worked on repairing fence posts, Mary Catherine opened her mother's journal with trembling fingers. Ellen Sullivan's neat handwriting filled the pages, beginning with mundane observations about farm life and gradually evolving into something far more serious. June 15th, 1884. Sheriff Harrison came by today while Thomas was in town. Asked questions about cattle movements through our eastern pasture. Seems to think someone's been altering brands and selling stolen livestock. "I've seen the men he's talking about, Jake Morrison's crew. They ride through our land like they own it." July 3rd, 1884, counted Morrison's cattle herd as they passed through today. 47 head, but the brands looked fresh on at least a dozen. Harrison is right to be suspicious. Someone needs to document this properly. August 20th, 1884, Harrison asked me to help him gather evidence. "It's dangerous, but I can't stand by and watch thieves prosper while honest farmers struggle. Mary Catherine is old enough now to help with the farm work if something happens to me. Thomas doesn't know, can't know. He'd try to stop me. And this is too important." The entries continued through the fall and winter, detailing a systematic investigation into Morrison's cattle rustling operation. Ellen had documented dates, numbers of cattle, suspicious activities, even conversations she'd overheard in town. She'd been methodical, brave, and ultimately doomed. The final entry was dated 3 days before her death, March 10th, 1885. "Harrison plans to arrest Morrison and his men this week. We're meeting at the waterfall tomorrow to review the evidence one final time. I pray we're doing the right thing. I pray Mary Catherine will understand someday why her mother took such risks. Some fights are worth having, even when the cost is everything you hold dear." Mary Catherine closed the journal with tears streaming down her face. Her mother had been a hero, and she died for it. But more importantly, Ellen Sullivan had documented everything: dates, locations, details that could still be used to expose Morrison's crimes, if anyone was brave enough to present them. The problem was credibility. 8 years later, with both Ellen and Sheriff Harrison dead, who would believe accusations based on an old diary? Mary Catherine needed current evidence, proof that Morrison's criminal activities were ongoing. That afternoon, she walked to town with the excuse of buying supplies, but her real purpose was reconnaissance. Cedar Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The general store, run by German immigrants named Heinrich and Greta Müller, served as the unofficial information center for the community. "Mary Catherine," Greta Müller called out as she entered the store. How is your father? We haven't seen him in weeks." "He's well, Mrs. Muller, working hard, as always." Mary Catherine selected a few necessary items: sugar, coffee, ammunition for her father's rifle, while carefully steering the conversation toward her real interest. "I heard Jake Morrison's been expanding his cattle operation. Must be doing well for himself." Heinrich, restocking shelves behind the counter, made a sound that might have been skepticism. "Morrison does well for himself, yes. Always has money when others struggle. Makes a person wonder—" "Heinrich," Greta warned in German, but her husband continued. "I'm old enough to remember when an honest rancher's herd grew slowly, through careful breeding and fair trading. Morrison's herd seemed to multiply overnight." He lowered his voice. "And he always has gold coins when most folks pay with scrip or trade goods." Mary Catherine's pulse quickened. Gold coins. Just last week, he bought 50 pounds of salt beef and paid with $20 gold pieces. Fresh minted they were. Heinrich shook his head. Where does a cattle rancher get that kind of cash in a drought year? Before Mary Catherine could respond, the store's front door opened with a sharp jangle, and Jake Morrison himself walked in. He was alone, but his presence seemed to fill the small space with tension. Heinrich immediately busied himself with inventory, and Greta's friendly demeanor became noticeably strained. "Morrison," Heinrich nodded curtly. "Muller." Morrison's cold gaze swept the store, lingering on Mary Catherine with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Miss Sullivan, don't often see you in town. Just picking up some supplies, Mr. Morrison." She kept her voice level despite the fear creeping up her spine. "Of course. How's your father's farm doing? I heard the drought's been hard on everyone." His tone was conversational, but Mary Catherine heard the undertone of threat. "We're managing." She gathered her purchases, eager to leave. "I'm sure you are. Your mother was quite resourceful. I imagine she passed that trait on to you." Morrison stepped closer, and Mary Catherine caught the smell of tobacco and something else, something metallic that reminded her unpleasantly of blood. "Give my regards to your father. Tell him if he ever needs help with anything at all, he knows where to find me." Mary Catherine nodded and left the store as quickly as she could without running. Once outside, she realized her hands were shaking. Morrison's message had been clear. He was watching her family, and he remembered her mother all too well. But his veiled threats had also confirmed something important. He was still active, still confident in his power, and still profitable enough to spend gold coins freely. Whatever criminal enterprise had gotten Sheriff Harrison and her mother killed was ongoing. That evening, as she helped her father with the livestock, Mary Catherine made her decision. She would continue her mother's work, but she wouldn't make Ellen's mistake of trusting the wrong person or acting without a solid plan. She needed allies, evidence, and most importantly, she needed to be smarter than the people who had gotten her mother killed. The stream still flowed past their property, carrying its secrets toward the hidden waterfall. Tomorrow, Mary Catherine would follow it again, not as a lonely farm girl seeking escape, but as someone determined to finish what her mother had started. Justice for Ellen Sullivan, justice for Sheriff Harrison, and an end to Jake Morrison's reign of terror, no matter what it cost. As she fell asleep that night, Mary Catherine clutched her mother's journal to her chest and made a silent promise. She would not let fear win. She would not let evil prosper. She would find a way to expose the truth, even if it killed her. 3 weeks of careful planning had led to this moment. Mary Catherine crouched in the pre-dawn darkness behind a cluster of sagebrush, watching Jake Morrison's ranch through a pair of field glasses she'd borrowed from her father's hunting supplies. Her heart pounded steadily, but her hands were calm. The frightened girl who had stumbled upon murder had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, someone her mother would have recognized. Using her mother's journal as a guide, she documented cattle movements and discovered Morrison's pattern of selling stolen livestock to railroad construction crews every month when the westbound supply train stopped at Cedar Ridge. Today was the day of the monthly cattle sale. What Morrison didn't know was that Mary Catherine had allies now. Heinrich Müller had agreed to help after seeing her mother's journal, and more importantly, she had contacted the Territorial Marshal Service. Marshal Samuel Hayes was due to arrive on today's eastbound train. At the railroad depot, everything proceeded as expected. The livestock cars were waiting, railroad men loaded the cattle efficiently, and gold coins changed hands. Mary Catherine documented everything in her notebook, sketching brand marks and recording details. What she hadn't expected was to see her father walking toward the depot. Thomas Sullivan approached Morrison's group with hesitant steps. Mary Catherine's blood ran cold as she realized Morrison had lured her father into a trap. "Sullivan," Morrison called out, "glad you could make it. We have business to discuss." "I got your message," Thomas replied. "You mentioned something about my late wife's activities." Morrison smiled coldly. "Ellen was remarkable. Curious. Perhaps too curious for her own good." He gestured toward the loaded cattle cars. "She took quite an interest in my business operations." "Ellen died of fever," Thomas said firmly, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Of course she did. But before her unfortunate illness, she was asking questions, writing things down, making friends with people who shared her concerns." Karl Kowalski moved to flank Thomas, cutting off his escape route. Mary Catherine realized Morrison intended to eliminate the remaining Sullivan family members right here. "Your wife was working with Sheriff Harrison to gather evidence against my enterprises," Morrison continued. "When Harrison disappeared, she continued the investigation. That made her a liability." The admission hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You killed her," he whispered. "I did what was necessary," Morrison replied. "Just like I'm about to do now." Morrison drew his revolver, but Thomas Sullivan was no longer the grief-stricken farmer who had accepted his wife's death as natural. He was a man who had just learned the woman he loved had been murdered. Thomas threw himself sideways as Morrison's shot shattered the morning air. The bullet caught him in the shoulder instead of his heart, spinning him but not dropping him. Mary Catherine broke from cover, her mother's journal clutched in one hand and her father's spare pistol in the other. "Leave him alone!" Her appearance shocked everyone, except Marshal Samuel Hayes, who stepped off the eastbound train with his badge displayed and weapon drawn. "Nobody move! Territorial Marshal Service!" The platform erupted into chaos. Morrison, seeing his empire crumbling, grabbed Mary Catherine and pressed his pistol to her head. "Everyone stay back. The girl dies if anyone moves." But Morrison had miscalculated. Mary Catherine Sullivan was no longer the frightened farm girl who had hidden at the waterfall. She was her mother's daughter, and Ellen Sullivan had never backed down from a fight. Mary Catherine drove her elbow backward into Morrison's solar plexus with all her strength. As he doubled over gasping, she twisted away, and Thomas's rifle spoke, this time with lethal accuracy. Jake Morrison fell to the depot platform and moved no more. Marshal Hayes arrested the surviving gang members and recovered the stolen cattle. The evidence Mary Catherine had gathered, combined with her mother's journal, painted a clear picture of nearly a decade of criminal enterprise. 3 days later, Mary Catherine stood beside the hidden waterfall with her father and Marshal Hayes as they buried Sheriff Harrison's remains properly. "Your mother would be proud," Hayes said. "She died trying to see justice done, and because of her courage, and yours, that's exactly what happened. The loneliness that had driven her to follow the stream was gone, replaced by purpose and connection she'd never experienced before." As they walked back along the stream toward home, Thomas put his good arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Your mother followed this water to its source and found something worth dying for. Today, you finished what she started." Mary Catherine looked back at the waterfall, where water continued to flow as it had for countless years, carrying away secrets and sorrows while bringing new possibilities. The stream had led her to terrible truths and hard choices, but also to justice and redemption. The lonely farmer's girl was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the most important discoveries aren't found at the end of a journey, but in the courage to begin one. 6 months later, Mary Catherine Sullivan stood on the platform of the Cedar Ridge train depot, the same platform where her father had nearly died and where justice had finally been served. But this time, she wasn't watching criminals conduct their business. She was preparing to leave. The badge pinned to her traveling coat caught the morning sunlight, a deputy marshal's star that Marshal Hayes had personally recommended her for after witnessing her courage and investigative abilities. At 18, she would be one of the youngest, and certainly one of the first female deputy marshals in the Nebraska Territory. But Hayes had convinced the territorial governor that exceptional circumstances called for exceptional appointments. "You sure about this, Mary Cat?" Thomas asked, though his voice carried pride rather than concern. The months since Morrison's death had transformed him as much as they had his daughter. With the criminal threat eliminated and compensation received for the stolen cattle, their farm was finally prospering. More importantly, Thomas had found peace with Ellen's memory. Not the bitter grief of losing her to disease, but the proud sorrow of losing her to heroism. "I'm sure, Pa." Mary Catherine adjusted the leather satchel containing her mother's journal, which she would carry as both reminder and inspiration. "Ma started something important when she decided to fight injustice. I want to continue that work." Heinrich Müller approached with a wrapped package. "From Greta and me," he said, his accented English warm with affection. "Bread and sausage for your journey, and," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "a small flask of schnapps for emergencies only." Mary Catherine smiled, accepting the package. The German immigrant had become an unexpected ally and friend, his own experiences with corruption making him a valuable witness in the trials that had followed Morrison's death. The Kowalski brothers and their accomplices had received lengthy prison sentences, and the stolen cattle had been returned to their rightful owners. "Take care of yourself, young lady," Heinrich continued, "and remember, courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." "Charge!" The eastbound train whistle echoed across the prairie, signaling 5 minutes until departure. Mary Catherine embraced her father, breathing in the familiar sense of pipe tobacco and honest work that would always remind her of home. "Right often," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "And remember that no matter how far this job takes you, you'll always have a place here." "I will, Pa. And you take care of yourself, too. Maybe think about asking Sarah Henderson if she'd like to come to Sunday dinner sometime." Mary Catherine had noticed the way the neighboring widow and her father looked at each other during church services, and she suspected Ellen would have approved of Thomas finding companionship again. Thomas blushed slightly, but didn't deny the suggestion. "Maybe I will. Your mother always said life was for living, not just surviving." As Mary Catherine boarded the train, she reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon, when she'd first followed the stream, seeking nothing more than escape from loneliness. She'd found murder, conspiracy, and deadly danger. But she'd also found purpose, justice, and most importantly, herself. The train pulled away from Cedar Ridge with a great rush of steam and grinding of wheels, carrying her toward her new assignment in Cheyenne. Through the window she watched the familiar landscape roll past, the struggling farms, the endless prairie, and in the distance, the line of hills where a hidden waterfall continued to flow. That waterfall had been the catalyst for everything that followed. It had revealed terrible secrets, but it had also revealed Mary Catherine's own strength and determination. Now, as she traveled toward an uncertain future, she carried those lessons with her. Her first assignment would be investigating reports of claim, jumping, and violence against homesteaders in the Wyoming Territory. Work that would require the same careful observation, patient investigation, and personal courage that had brought down Jake Morrison's criminal empire. Mary Catherine Sullivan, no longer lonely, no longer just a farmer's daughter, settled back in her seat and opened a new notebook. On the first page she wrote, "Deputy Marshal Mary Catherine Sullivan, Personal Log, Day 1. following new streams toward unknown destinations. Some journeys begin with curiosity, but continue with conviction. Whatever lies ahead, I carry with me the memory of those who died seeking justice and the determination to ensure their sacrifice was not in vain. Outside the train window, the Nebraska prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, full of possibilities as vast as the sky itself. And somewhere behind her, a stream still flowed toward a hidden waterfall, carrying the whispers of the past and the promises of the future in its eternal song. The lonely farmer's girl had found her calling at last.